Hello, beloved. How's your scripture reading going? You know, one of the ways that I use to study scripture is a practice called Lectio Divina. It's an exercise in praying the scriptures, as some people call it. Rather than reading for understanding, we read and pray over the scriptures so that God may speak to us through the scriptures. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the 4 stages of Lectio Divina, and as I do, I'm also going to show you what it looks like. And so I'm going to invite you to read along with me, and we'll do it together a little bit today. Okay? Now, it's good when you do Lectio Divina to have a piece of paper or a journal handy that you can write down some things that you're thinking. And today, we're going to use Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. Okay? So, Lectio Divina was originally developed by Saint Benedict and was widely used in Benedictine monasteries. It's something that was intended for individual study. It's something that I use for individual study often, but it's also something that you can do in a small group of 4 to 8 people. So, maybe a Zoom call, maybe once you're able, get people together and have a small group study using Lectio Divina. So it starts with the first movement, which is Lectio. Almost dropped my Bible there. It starts with the first movement, Lectio, listening for the gentle touch of Christ's word. The goal in Lectio is to silence our own thoughts in order to listen for the still small voice of God to speak to us. So I'm going to read through the scripture just once, and I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Now while Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." I'm going to read it through a second time. As I read the scripture a second time, I'm going to invite you to listen for a particular word or phrase that catches your attention in this passage. If you do have something to write it down with, I'd encourage you to write that down so that you don't forget it. A word or a phrase, or any words or phrase that jump out at you. Don't think yet about why they jump out at you, just anything that jumps out at you. Now when Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Some words and phrases that stuck out to me were waste, the poor you always have with you, burial, very costly. Why do you trouble the woman? Service. Now, if you're in a group, you can then begin to move on to the next portion, which is meditatio, which we've begun, meditation, on what words or phrases have have come to each person's mind. You can share one or two words or phrases with each other. Now, the challenge here is to do so without elaborating or explaining it. So note that when I shared my words and phrases, I didn't tell you why they stuck out to me, or why I thought they stuck out to me, or what I think they meant. That will come later, but for right now, all I did was tell you what stuck out to me. I'm going to invite you to consider how those words are touching you personally today, and maybe how this passage is meeting you where you are. Now I'm going to read scripture a third time. We're going to move to Oratio, the third phase of Lectio Divina. And this time I want you to think silently and write down reflections, not just of words or phrases, but you're going to direct your attention a little bit more to things that you see or hear or feel. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? Start every reflection with that. I see, I feel, I hear. Okay? Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She's performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? For me, I see an act of love. I feel intimacy between the woman and Jesus. I hear angry disciples. I hear sharp but gentle correction from Jesus. Now again, if you're doing this in a group, I'd invite you to share your reflections or your feelings and your sentences with each other. Again, with no elaboration or explanation. Remember, I did not share with you why I thought that I was seeing or hearing or feeling something, or what I thought those things that I saw and felt and heard meant. Again, there will be a time for that, but we're still not there yet. You see how this is slowing us down, helping us to pray the scriptures instead of immediately jumping to some sort of moral lesson or conclusion about what this scripture passage means. It's a way of slowing us down and helping us to read into the scripture a little bit more, to let it speak to us rather than us jumping to conclusions. In fact, I think this is actually most helpful with the stories and the passages of scriptures we know best. Because if you've ever read something that you've read a lot of times in the Bible before, or you've heard about a lot, you know how you kind of fill in the blanks and you just end up skimming over it because you think, oh, I know this story. Lectio Divina is a way of slowing us down. So before we get to what the lesson is, we stop and pause and think about what is it that's drawing our attention? And what is it in this scripture that is making us feel something? Or what are we seeing or hearing that we never saw or heard any other times we've read it? Finally, we get to the last part of Lectio Divina, called contemplatio, or contemplation, resting in the presence of God. I'm going to read to you the scripture one last time, again, from Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 6 and continuing through verse 13. As I read this scripture, I want you now to start thinking about what God is calling you to do today, or who God is calling you to be. What call is God placing on your life? Or what call is God placing on our life together? think about those things as I read. Now while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Now, if you're in a group setting, you can share your reflections with each other. If you're not, you can just write down what reflections you might have, what God is calling you to be or do today. This time, when you're sharing reflections in a group, you can share in greater detail if you wish. But of course, be mindful of your time and however much time you have, and make sure that everybody has a chance to share if they wish. You can close as a group by committing to pray for each other in each particular way. Perhaps I'm thinking, as I read this passage, at the intimacy that this woman feels with Jesus as he approaches his death in a few days. And as I think about Jesus' death, makes me feel like perhaps God is calling me to spend more time giving up costly things so that I can draw closer into a more intimate relationship with Jesus. So that I can understand the love that Jesus has displayed for me in his death. And so that I can reciprocate that love in as much as I am able by pouring out all that I have and all that I am for God. That's what I'm going to be thinking about and reflecting on, and that's how I am going to commit to answering God's call for me today. This passage might be speaking something different to you, and that's good. That's okay. That's part of why this is a good thing to do in a group. Hold on to those reflections. Commit to following the call that God has given you today through this Lectio Divina, and try to do it on your own or with a group. That's all for today. Remember, you are God's beloved.